1 week. That's how long it had been since a faded plaid umbrella found its way back into her hands on a rain-soaked train platform. 7 days of coffee dates and quiet walks, and the terrifying, wonderful feeling of falling for the same person twice. 7 days of convincing herself that maybe, this time, the story could end differently. And on the seventh morning, while Rin slept beside her on the couch, exhausted from staying up too late talking about everything they'd missed, Aiko's phone lit up with the exact email she had been quietly dreading for weeks. She stared at the subject line, then at him, then back at the screen, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in the exact same way it had 5 years ago. The wording was different. The stakes were somehow both smaller and larger. But the shape of the choice was identical, and that terrified her more than anything. 5 years ago, a choice exactly like this one had cost them everything they had built. This time, sitting in the quiet gold of that early morning, Aiko made herself a single, quiet promise. Whatever happened next, she would not choose silence again. This is the story of what it costs to love someone twice. The week since the train station reunion had been unlike anything either of them expected. Neither of them rushed back into what they used to be. Both were too aware of how easily it had broken the first time and too afraid of repeating the same mistakes at a faster pace than before. So instead, they rebuilt slowly, deliberately, like two people carefully relearning a language they used to speak fluently. There was coffee after work, twice that first week, then 3 times the second. There were long walks that stretched far past their intended destination, conversations about nothing in particular that somehow filled hours without either of them noticing the time. They talked about the years apart in careful pieces, not everything at once, but enough to slowly fill in the outlines of 5 years spent as strangers to each other's lives. Rin introduced her again to the friends who still remembered her. Some greeted her warmly, genuinely happy to see the girl who had once made their quiet friend laugh so easily. Others were more guarded, remembering all too well the year Rin had spent barely speaking, and they weren't in any hurry to trust her simply because she had come back. Meeting his sister was harder still. She studied Aiko across the dinner table with the guarded eyes of someone who had spent years quietly patching up her brother after a heartbreak he never fully discussed. She didn't say much that first evening. She didn't need to. Her silence asked the only question that mattered. Are you going to do it again? Trust, they both discovered, isn't rebuilt with grand declarations or dramatic apologies. It's rebuilt in small, almost boring, deeply consistent moments. A good night text sent without being asked, a promise about being on time that was actually kept, a phone left face up on the table with nothing hidden inside it. Each small act was its own quiet repayment on an old debt neither of them had ever formally acknowledged. Slowly, the careful distance between them began to soften at the edges. Rin caught himself laughing without the familiar ache that used to sit underneath every good moment, the quiet voice that used to whisper, "Don't get used to this." For the first time in 5 years, the voice grew quieter. And Aiko, walking home alone one evening after a night that had felt almost effortlessly happy, allowed herself something she hadn't dared to feel in half a decade. The fragile, dangerous hope that this time, things might actually turn out differently. The email that had woken her that morning was from her research institute. A renewed 5-year contract, this time with a full promotion attached to it. Senior researcher. Her own small team. It was everything she had spent a decade working toward, delivered in the most inconvenient possible week of her life. It required her to confirm relocation within 5 days. 5 days to decide. again, between the life she had built for herself and the fragile, precious things she and Run were only just beginning to rebuild. Aiko sat with the email open for exactly 4 minutes, staring at the same paragraph until the words blurred together. Then she did something she had never done 5 years earlier. She picked up her phone, and instead of drafting apologies she would never send, she called Rin immediately before she had even fully decided what she wanted to do about the offer at all. "I need to tell you something before I even decide what I'm going to do about it," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pace of her heart. And then she told him everything, the promotion, the deadline, the fear, all of it on the very same day she had learned it herself. Not a single day of silence stood between the truth and the telling this time. Rin listened without interrupting, feeling something old and familiar rise quietly in his chest. It wasn't the fear that she might leave without telling him. She was, after all, telling him immediately, exactly as she'd promised herself she would. It was a smaller, more insidious fear that the specific shape of this exact situation, no matter how honestly handled, might still end in the same place it had 5 years before. That night, Rin couldn't sleep. He sat out on his balcony long after midnight, replaying every version of the last 5 years in his mind. The empty bench, the dusty umbrella in his closet, the hollow ache of looking for someone in a crowd who was never going to be there. He told himself this was different. He almost believed it. His friend Daichi, who had quietly watched him grieve for half a decade without ever fully understanding why, called him the next morning sensing something was wrong before Run had said a single word about it. "You're scared this is happening again," Daichi said. It wasn't posed as a question. Rin didn't bother denying it. "She told me right away this time," he admitted. "That's different. That has to count for something." Daichi studied him for a long moment before answering. "Then why do you already sound like you're saying goodbye?" Rin didn't have a good answer. The uncomfortable truth was that being told about a coming storm doesn't make you any less afraid of drowning in it. Knowing the reason for the rain doesn't keep you dry. And so, instead of turning to Aiko and explaining the fear sitting quietly in his chest, Rin did the one thing he had promised himself he'd never do again. He went quiet, not with anger, and not as a punishment the way silence sometimes is. It was the quiet of a man bracing for impact, pulling back just enough, he told himself, to protect what was left of his heart if history decided to repeat itself after all. The change was small at first. A slightly delayed reply. Maybe, where there used to be a definite plan. A walk home that used to stretch to 2 unhurried hours, now taking barely 20 quiet minutes. Aiko felt it immediately. 5 years ago, she would have assumed the worst, quietly begun protecting herself, and disappeared before he had the chance to reject her outright, the exact same instinct that had cost them everything the first time. But this time, she remembered the promise she had made to herself on that quiet gold morning a week before. She showed up at his apartment on a Thursday evening, carrying the old plaid umbrella even though the sky outside was perfectly clear, and knocked until he had no choice but to open the door. "You're pulling away," she said, before he had the chance to pretend otherwise. "And I think I understand exactly why. But I'm not going to let us end the same way twice, with both of us quietly assuming the worst and saying absolutely nothing about it." Rin stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the old instinct to protect himself and the new, terrifying pull to let her all the way in instead. He let her in. They sat across from each other on his couch, the same couch where she had fallen asleep beside him only a week earlier. And for the first time, Rin said the thing he had been too afraid to admit even to himself. "I'm not scared that you'll leave without telling me." he said quietly. I know now that you would tell me. I'm scared that even when you do everything right, even when you're honest, even when you try your absolute hardest, it still ends the exact same way. That maybe some distances are simply too far to survive, no matter how much either of us wants them not to be. Aiko sat with that admission for a long, quiet moment because it was fair and because she understood that particular fear better than almost anyone alive. She had lived inside it for 5 years herself. I can't promise you it'll be easy, she finally said. I can't even promise you this ends differently than it did before. I wish I could, but that would be a lie, and we've had enough of those between us already. What I can promise is that I won't choose silence again, and I need you to promise me the same thing in return. Not that you'll never be scared, because that's an impossible thing to ask of anyone. Just that you'll tell me when you are, instead of quietly pulling away and letting me guess. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't the kind of fairy tale promise where nothing ever goes wrong again. It was something smaller, more fragile, and somehow far more real. Two people agreeing, out loud, to be scared together instead of alone. To carry the fear openly rather than burying it where it could quietly poison everything a second time. In the end, neither of them made the kind of grand, dramatic sacrifice that movies like to promise. Aiko accepted the position in Boston. It was, after everything, still the opportunity of a lifetime, and this time she wasn't going to abandon her own future out of fear either. Rin, meanwhile, had spent the previous 2 weeks quietly researching something he hadn't yet told her about. An internal transfer his logistics company maintained through a partner office in Boston. He submitted the request not because he expected her to wait for him the way he once had, silently, in the dark of a closet holding an unused umbrella, but because for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to actively choose to be near her, rather than simply hoping she might come back on her own. When he finally told her what he'd done, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both at once. It wasn't guaranteed to work. The transfer might be denied. Even if approved, it would take months, leaving an uncomfortable stretch of distance between them regardless. But this time, they were walking into that uncertainty with their eyes fully open. They stood together outside the restaurant afterward, sharing the same faded plaid umbrella that had somehow carried the entire weight of their story. Not as a symbol of everything they had lost the first time, but as proof of what they were choosing deliberately and out loud to carry forward together this time. Some love stories end with everything resolved perfectly, every fear erased, every distance closed, every doubt neatly answered. Theirs didn't, and maybe that's exactly why it felt true. It ended instead with something quieter and far more durable. Two people who had already lost each other once, choosing, with complete and open knowledge of exactly how much it could still hurt, to try again out loud instead of in silence. If you've ever had to rebuild trust with someone after it broke, let us know your own story in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this journey moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Echoes of Us Anime. We bring you a brand new emotional story just like this every single week. Thank you for listening, and until next time, don't let the silence speak for you.